This time on the Plutopia podcast, we explore an immigration crisis. Not the one you might think, but one that occurred almost 50 years ago. In the spring of 1975, I covered the arrival of children from Vietnam, children that were said to be orphans. Listen as we revisit this event and its aftermath.
On April 2nd, most of the world was gathered around their radios and TVs, witnessing one of the biggest media events of the Vietnam War. A World Airways jet carrying 54 Vietnamese children lifted off the runway at Ton Son Air Base in Saigon, defying orders from the control tower to not take off. In the ensuing hours, the children, characterized as war orphans, became the center of an international media circus.
I wonder if you'd mind telling us how the trip was.
Well, the trip went along very well. After we left Saigon, there was no problems at all.
How about getting out of Saigon? We've had a lot of reports that they told you not to leave. Was that correct?
I think they've got a press conference set up for us in here a little later on, and maybe we should talk there.
Is it true, though, that they told you from the tower that you could not leave, and you said, just watch me?
Yes, that's true.
Captain, congratulations. You can see all around here.
What is the age of most of the youngsters?
Oh,
Could you guess?
maybe about 3 or 4, maybe younger, too.
The language?
Maybe between 18 months and 3.
I bet you really didn't find that there was a language barrier.
No. No, kids are kids, my goodness.
What did you play?
Oh, just tried to talk to them. They can't understand you, but trying to say, hello, just talking, just attention.
Are they aware of what's happening?
I don't know. I really don't know. There's some on board that are aware.
Did they sleep most of the time? Did they run
Some of them were up.
or chaotic?
Both. Just kids, for heaven's sakes. Just
But they weren't really
kids.
hysterical or anything like that?
No.
Captain, what did this flight, what did it mean to you personally?
Well, it was a great opportunity. My only regret is that we couldn't have brought more children out of Vietnam.
What was running through your mind when the plane took off and they told you not to leave?
Nothing particular, except that we wanted to get out. We thought it was time to leave.
What was the situation in Saigon when you left?
Well, we got a report. The tower called and said they were closing down the field. They had VC on the airport. And they closed the tower, they turned off the runway lights, and closed the field.
Is the experience in Vietnam of the past week the most serious in your life?
Well, it's one of the most serious, yes.
You were around in, mainland China, too? And
Yes, that's true. Same type thing.
how does this compare to it?
It's almost identical.
What about the flight itself? What was that like?
The flight coming over here was very smooth. It was just one big playpen for the children. They had a ball back there.
A statement was made that there would be no chance of getting any more children out. What is the basis of this statement? This was made in Tokyo.
Well, all of Vietnam seems to have fallen by now, except Saigon, and how long Saigon will last is anybody's guess.
So there's no chance at all for...
Well, I wouldn't say there's no chance. One of the big problems, of course, is the bureaucracy getting the children released. Between the U.S. government and the Vietnamese government, it's unbelievable what you have to go through to get these children released.
Captain, did you hear those orders apparently that were issued for you not to take off from Saigon?
We had radio failure.
You didn't hear any command that you were not supposed to take off?
We had radio failure at that point.
No one else heard it either?
Not that I know of.
Captain Healy, is World Airways trying to change their public image? About 2 months ago when you were flying into Phnom Penh, nobody here would let us talk to any pilots, and now that you're flying orphans out of Vietnam, you seem anxious to get media attention. Is this true?
I don't have the answer to that. I've just come in from 2 months out in that area, and I have no idea what's going on.
Are you going to go back for another plane load of kids?
If I'm asked to, yes. I haven't been asked to yet.
Will you take ammunition back with you when you go back to Saigon or Phnom Penh?
This is something I couldn't answer.
But do you make a distinction in your own mind between delivering orphans to this country and taking weapons and fuel to make war and...
As a pilot, I'll haul anything anywhere that I'm told.
Most of the media attention was focused upon the dramatic nature of the takeoff from Saigon. Only a handful of the reporters present at the Oakland airport even bothered to question World Airways' motives for the grandiose media event. It was the CBS Evening News that revealed one possible clue in a sidebar item to the news of the World Airways flight from Vietnam. They noted that World Airways had announced at about the same time the plane was leaving Saigon their intention to apply for FAA approval of a new transcontinental service for the airline. World Airways Vice President Charles Patterson vigorously denied the flight was a grandstand play for publicity. He claimed the announcement of the new transcontinental run was a, quote, coincidence. As the orphan airlift continues, little attention has been focused upon the protest voiced by many charitable groups operating in Southeast Asia. Some groups, such as Caritas and the American Friends Service Committee, have condemned the removal of the so-called orphans from their own country. I recently spoke with Jane Barton of the American Friends Service Committee.
I'm opposed to the airlift of these orphans because I feel that it's sort of a continuation of the policy that Americans have had during the Vietnam War of always telling the Americans what's best for the Vietnamese. I feel very strongly that the Vietnamese will be able to take care of their own children, and that these are Vietnamese children. They should remain in Vietnam, and I feel really strongly opposed to the fact that we're bringing them over here.
Have you had the opportunity to talk to some of the people with the various adoption agencies that are bringing these children in and with AID?
Mm-hmm.
Have you gotten any reaction from them to the things you've been saying about the orphan airlift?
Yeah, I went to the press conference that the adoption agencies and other organizations that are working on the airlift had last Thursday. And I talked today with another member of one of the organizations that's involved. And I've expressed my hesitations. I think most of these people are totally unaware of the situation that they're participating in. You know, they don't speak Vietnamese. They don't know what's going on in Saigon when the kids get on the plane. They're simply receiving them here. I also don't think that they realize that people like Ambassador Graham Martin have been saying, "Oh, isn't this wonderful that the Embassy and State Department and USAID are involved in orphan airlift because it will help soften up the American hearts, so that they'll then give more military aid to Vietnam." I think these adoption agencies and relief groups don't see that they're participating in, kind of collaborating right now with the U.S. government in a policy of trying to get more money to hold up the Saigon government. And also they're, in that way, I think, making the children political pawns.
You feel then that this actually is not just an humanitarian effort, but is also a bit of publicity for the South Vietnamese regime and also for the USAID operations?
Oh, certainly. I think this orphan airlift is one of the biggest propaganda, or publicity stunts that has occurred during the history of the Vietnam War. I basically think that Americans are just being, they're opening up their hearts out of goodwill. They just don't understand that it's a misguided situation, and that the Vietnamese there's some racism involved here too, I think, of feeling that somehow Vietnamese aren't capable of caring for children as well as Americans can.
A recent Saigon dispatch from Associated Press had said that the communists have an excellent record in looking after the children, and that the orphans under the communists would probably be better off than the present Saigon government. Do you agree with this statement?
Right. Well, I think that in the past, if you look at what's happened to children in North Vietnam and in areas controlled by the Provisional Revolutionary Government, it is a fact that there really aren't institutions for orphans. That is what the policy has been by the North Vietnamese and the PRG, is to get the children into extended family situations or foster homes. On some occasion, I think the PRG has had orphanages in their area but they've had a lot of personnel kind of tried to create little family situations within the orphanage, having young men and women, and grouping the children in with a varying age pattern. So I think that the children probably would be very adequately cared for by the communists, as they're called.
Well, recently there was a TV documentary in which they were saying that allegedly children are bought and sold on the black market in Saigon. Have you any information about this? Have you heard this report?
Yes, when I worked in Vietnam, it was well known that children could be bought and sold in the, on a black market. There were also people that went into maternity hospitals and tried to buy children from women. A couple of voluntary agencies began to work in the hospitals, trying to prevent these people from coming into the hospitals to put pressure on women to sell their children. There's also a TV documentary done by, I believe it was NBC, called Sins of Their Fathers. And there was a picture of an American woman who works for one of these adoption agencies that's bringing the kids over now, trying to get women in Da Nang to sell their kids to her. And it's, in this documentary.
So then this is not just a rumor. There have been actually people that have seen the buying and selling of children.
Oh, yeah. And I think that, we shouldn't make it a criticism of the Vietnamese that on occasion they've had to sell their children. When somebody offers you a year's salary for your child and promises you that it will go to an orphanage where it might be well cared for, the Vietnamese almost consider that an act of sacrifice as something that's better for the child, and that a mother would be selfish if she kept it. But I think it's misinterpreted by American society that if they hear, on occasion that a Vietnamese mother has sold her child, that this is the Vietnamese mother not loving her child, when I think it's actually somewhat the opposite. Also, the kind of pressure that's put on people because of the war is, of course, phenomenal. And, of course, I'm opposed to really any Vietnamese children. I feel pretty much that most, it's a rare case if a Vietnamese child should be brought over here. But I think those rare cases might include some severely disabled kids, like a child that might be a quad or amputee or completely paralyzed. There might be certain kinds of medical equipment and, things like wheelchairs and sidewalks and things that are more comfortable here for a severely injured child to adjust, have a more normal life in the United States than they might in Vietnam.
Dr. Edith Lord, who's a Miami psychologist, has said that the main reason that people are adopting these children is a feeling of guilt. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, I feel that most Americans right now are adopting these Vietnamese children out of a feeling of guilt. There are, thousands of American children that are up for adoption. We don't need to go to Vietnam and take their children. But I think that this is a way of putting salve on the wounds and hurt that Americans feel because of the war. There's a tremendous sense of guilt, I think, over this situation.
Other than the adoption of these refugee children as a way of, if someone feels guilt, is there a better way that you feel to take care of this feeling?
Well, the American Friends Service Committee and a lot of other groups around, in fact, really around the world, because today I heard that 3 major relief organizations in Europe, Caritas and I don't know the names of the other groups, have all called for people to, rather than adopting children, for people to send money to international organizations that are working right now in Vietnam to try to keep the children in Vietnam and to help all of the children, all of the new refugee children and others that are facing a very difficult situation, to alleviate the situation in Vietnam rather than bringing the kids here. And groups like UNICEF and the American Friends Service Committee and the Mennonites, a group called International Children's Fund, and there's a Buddhist group in Paris that are all collecting money to be used in Vietnam for the children there. And also, most of those organizations are going to help children in all the areas of Vietnam. For instance, the United Nations right now is involved in helping respond to the Provisional Revolutionary Government's request for aid to help all of the thousands of people that have just come under their control in the 17 provinces that they took over. When I was at the Presidio, I was able to talk to a number of children that did have living parents. There were, two other girls that were already sent on a plane this morning, who both said they had a mother. Another half black child, half Vietnamese child, said that he had both parents and had a grandmother. A little boy I talked to said he had both parents, but his father was a soldier, and he lost his mother when they had fled as refugees. I think the Americans that have misjudged the situation, because you see, in Vietnam there are a lot of kids in orphanages that do have a single parent, and the orphanages know that. Because the economic situation, because of war danger, a lot of Vietnamese put their kids temporarily in orphanages. But what happened was that the Americans, in this desire to get these kids over, have done it illegally. They've pushed aside any the usual necessary paperwork that's had to occur, and the Vietnamese government has opposed this. The Saigon government yesterday, in fact, said that the airlift was going to halt. Then the American embassy put so much pressure on, on the Saigon government that within an hour they reversed their policy on this.
Okay, on the subject of the hasty methods they're using, the first story that I did for Zodiac News on this, I'll just read you the last paragraph. It said, in Saigon last week, World Airways President Ed Daly reportedly gathered the first 54 children for the orphan evacuation, quote, from any place we could find them, unquote. The Los Angeles Times reports that Daly did not obtain individual visas for the children. He waived instead a handful of $100 bills at a Vietnamese official demanding exit visas. The official quickly obtained a blanket visa for the entire group. Is this a common procedure? Have you heard of anything else like this?
Well, at this press conference that was held last Thursday by the people, it was announced at the press conference that USAID and the immigration authorities had given blanket visas for all of these flights. And I just feel very strongly that because the Saigon government is opposed to it, that it's only because the Americans are there right now with more power, than TU has or the Saigon government has, and so they're being able to do it above the protests of the government and even perhaps some of the people concerned. A lot of these children might, in fact, have mothers in prison right now, because from my direct experience, I was working in a prison, and we were doing medical visits and giving food supplements to kids under the age of 2 years old. But at the age of 2, the kids were taken from their mothers, and they were put in orphanages. Now, in Saigon, there are some of the largest prisons for women prisoners. And so therefore, many of their kids are in Saigon orphanages. Now, how can, the mothers that are in prison have any knowledge of what this current situation is? And how can the kids get in touch with their mothers if they want to protest, they're having to be evacuated?
Do you think these women that are in prison, or in some cases perhaps both family members, mother and father, are these political prisoners or what?
Yeah, well, most of the people that I visited in the Quang Ngai prison were political prisoners. They were labeled that way by the government. they had little tags on them that said they were political prisoners as opposed to common criminals.
What did these people say about the position their children were in? Did you have a chance to ask any of these people that?
Oh, yeah. It was really a wrenching situation for the mothers. They would lie about how old their kids were in the prison because they wanted to try to keep them with them as long as they could. And when I worked in a prison, I remember one case where a woman had 2 kids and in an orphan that had been taken away from her and put in an orphanage. And one day she heard that a rich Vietnamese woman had adopted these 2 kids. And she had what I call sort of a hysterical seizure. She just began to froth and have muscle convulsions, and she, pounded her head on the floor. She just went literally, completely hysterical for about, 3 hours. It was I don't know how she had the stamina to kind of keep up, that kind of frenzy. But it just drove her mad because she really, cared for her children and loved them and hoped that maybe at least in the orphanage she would be able to get them back. But once this rich Vietnamese woman adopted them, and this was even in the country, of course it's going to be worse if, impossible for them to be returned if the kids have come to the United States. But the woman was just beside herself. Some voluntary agencies did a study in Saigon, and it showed that more than half of the kids in orphanages had at least one parent. And then there was a study of the National School of Administration, kind of a big graduate school in Saigon, that did a study in orphanages, and it found out that only 20% of the kids had lost both parents. And in 3 of the 6 orphanages that they did a study, 2/3 of the kids had parents living. So, those are statistics by the government, and, it's really amazing that right now the American public is being, duped into thinking that these are all orphans, they're going to get killed, they're starving, and we've got to help them. And this really isn't the case at all. I talked to one little boy at the Presidio, and he told me that when he left Vietnam, his mother actually came to the airport and helped put him on the plane, that she was mostly worried about the situation in Saigon being a panic situation as it has been in other cities, and she told him that he would be safest if he went to America, and she promised him that she would try to get him back. He had polio and had braces. He said just before she left him, she put her name and address and a little map in his, small suitcase, and told him never to lose this suitcase. Well, then the child was on that plane that crashed, and he survived, but he lost the suitcase. And so when he was recovered from the crash, he pleaded with the people, he said, that he wanted to go home to his mother so he could get the address again, because she had, made this agreement with him that they would try to be reunited after the fighting was over. But the boy said, now I don't have her address, and now I'm in America, and he kept crying, saying, Mon Jerlai, which means I want to go, I want to go back, I want to return.
At least 2,700 children were flown to the United States, and approximately 1,300 were flown to Canada, Europe, and Australia. In the years following Operation Babylift, as the flights were called, some adopted refugee children have returned to Vietnam seeking their families. Others have formed adoptee organizations. Web links to some of these groups will be posted with the story, but the story doesn't end here. As the South Vietnamese government began to fall, soldiers, officials, and other Vietnamese fled the country by plane, boat, and land routes. Among these refugees were many South Vietnamese military leaders. One controversial figure in this group, General Dang Van Quang, was spirited through the processing of refugees at Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. He was quickly resettled in Canada, When it was revealed he received special treatment and relocation, Canadian officials became alarmed. During the war, General Quang was alleged to be controlling the Vietnamese opium and heroin trade. As the controversy grew, I interviewed Derek Blackburn, a member of the Canadian Parliament.
Well, Mr. Young sent me an affidavit that was based on information that he had gathered from several other Vietnamese people living in the United States. Mr. Young, in 1970 and 71, was attached to the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. And apparently, as I understand it, came into possession of some information with respect to Quang's alleged dealings in the heroin trade in South Vietnam, a lot of which was going to U.S. servicemen. And he tried to pursue it as far as he could, and according to him, the C.I.A. prevented him from proceeding, and shortly thereafter he returned to the United States. Now, in the affidavit, he alleges many, many things about Quang. He says that Quang was involved in the luxury black market trade of cosmetics and whiskey, as well as the heroin trade. The selling of commissions when he was head of the 4th Corps of the Vietnamese Army. Things of this nature, and also extortion. Apparently, according to his information, Quang was selling exit visas almost up to the day that he finally got out of Saigon and came to the United States. Now, these are pretty damaging statements, and it is a notarized affidavit. And I presented this to the Minister of Immigration, Mr. Andrus, and I also released it to the press. Now, my problem right now is that I've been asking our Minister of Immigration many questions over the past 4 weeks, and I'm not getting any answers. So tomorrow, I'm holding a press conference at the National Press Club here in Ottawa, and General T, Nguyen Chan T, will be present. He's living in Washington at the present time, and he's coming to Canada, and he'll be there tomorrow morning. I should say 1:30 our time, tomorrow afternoon. And apparently he was the main source of information for Mr. McCoy's book, which I think was entitled The Politics of the Heroin Trade in Southeast Asia. And he has, according to my information, a lot of information with respect to General Quang. I am very, very put out at the fact that Quang came into Canada through Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, after an interview of approximately 2 to 3 minutes, when both the Canadian authorities and the American authorities knew Quang's background. He's in Canada on a ministerial permit, which can be revoked at any time by the minister, but Quang can then turn around and apply for refugee status. Now, once he does this and goes to court, all he has to do is prove that he's a refugee. He doesn't have to. In fact, no information or evidence can be introduced with respect to any of his previous activities. He simply has to prove that he's a refugee. So I think we're stuck with the guy. I don't see how we can get rid of him unless we deport him to South Vietnam, which probably would mean death.
Okay, now you say that he came in on a ministerial permit. Now, who was it that issued? Was this issued by the United States or by Canada?
No, this was issued by the vice consul in New Orleans. That is our man in New Orleans, who was acting as an immigration officer at Fort Chaffee. He was dispatched to Fort Chaffee because there were some 160 refugees at Fort Chaffee who had relatives in Canada, and therefore they had preference. Quang had 3 sons living in Montreal on visitors' visas at the time. The vice consul at the present time, as far as I know, feels rather badly about this. I think he feels that he made a mistake. In my opinion, he should have got in touch with Ottawa. The problem here is I haven't been able to discover whether or not Quang presented himself as Lieutenant General Quang, or whether he just presented himself as a Mr. Quang. Now, if he misrepresented himself, of course, he can then be deported. You know, he can be denied refugee status. But we haven't been able to prove this yet. So it was As I see it now, it was our mistake at Fort Chaffee. But you have to remember that when Mr. Moran, the vice consul, was processing these refugees, he was given a small room that was packed with refugees, all of them more or less dressed the same way. And, you know, he had to process them very quickly.
All right, you mentioned 160 some odd persons that were applying. Do you know if any of these persons were rejected?
Not that I know of.
So everyone that applied then was allowed into Canada?
Yeah, there is one person in California at the present time that you might be interested in. And his name is Nguyen Van Ngam.
Do you have the spelling on that?
Yes, it's Nguyen-VAN-NGAM. And he is presently being held in some camp in California.
Would it be Camp Pendleton?
It probably would be. Pendleton seems to be the major area for refugees. And he now has been denied access to Canada, and it may take up to a year to process his claim. This is what he's been told. It's rather interesting. Kwong comes through in 3 minutes, and this chap, Ngam, could take a year. It might take a year to process his application for landed status. Now, the reason for this is because Ngam apparently let it be known in California, where he was staying, that he was going to blow the lid off some of these undesirables from South Vietnam who have entered Canada, specifically Kwong and a few others. And it sounds rather ominous to me that he's being kept there, out of Canada, because of the statement that he made.
So do you feel that the immigration statutes of Canada are being applied selectively in some cases?
It could be. I can't prove it, but it seems to me, you see, in the city of Montreal, and this is where most of the high-ranking Vietnamese refugees are going because of the language. They speak French. There are several in Montreal who have come in, and they've set this up over a period of 2 or 3 or 4 years. They've sent immediate relatives into Canada for, you know, on landed status and so on. And I detect sort of a highly organized escape route for undesirables whom the Americans don't want. Kwong would be a terrible embarrassment to the C.I.A., for example, because he worked closely with the C.I.A. in South Vietnam. So in Canada, then of course he can't be subpoenaed to attend or to be a witness at a congressional hearing, for example. And he's just too hot to handle. As a matter of fact, the Americans won't take him back. That's all there is to it. They don't have to by their laws because he was only in transit at Fort Chaffee, Arkansas.
And you're
not to go to the States as a refugee.
In your investigations, have you had any contact with American officials of any sort?
Not directly, I haven't. But some of the newspaper men and a couple of people I have working for me in Montreal have been in contact. And the American authorities, like our own authorities in immigration, are very mum right now. They just won't talk.
All right. As to your sources on General Kwong, could you tell me exactly how this originally came to your attention and some of the sources of this information of him being involved in heroin traffic and other corruption in South Vietnam?
Well, McCoy's book, I suppose, is one of the major sources. That was published, I think, in 1972, if I'm not mistaken. There's a Professor Sam Newmoff at McGill University in Montreal who's been doing a lot of research into this. And Stephen Young is another source of information. And hopefully at the press conference tomorrow, which should be very well attended by our press people, and no doubt by American newspapermen in Ottawa, hopefully General T will be able to give us a lot more information on it.
Oh, one thing, could you give me the spelling of General T, please, his full name?
Yeah, it's Nguyen, N-G-U-Y-E-N, Chan, C-H-A-N-H, T, T-H-I. He was a Buddhist, and he was kicked out of the Diem regime, both the Diem regime, as you know, and the Thieu regime. at the top at least, we're all Catholics. And the Buddhists, of course, were looked down upon by both of those regimes. I'm concerned, actually, that Mr. Sweeney, that Canada is becoming a dumping ground for the undesirables. Now, I'm not for a moment stating that the Americans have put pressure on the Canadian government to take these people off their hands, but it just seems to me that some of these people who are coming in are people who should more appropriately be staying in the United States if the United States wants to grant them refugee status.
I'd like to close just with your reaction to this statement from Mr. McCoy's book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. And he quotes the Pentagon Papers as referring to General Quang. It says here, quote, General Quang was considered one of the, quote, most corrupt generals in South Vietnam in 1965, 1966. Now, this man is being sent by the Americans, supposedly, to your country. Do you feel this shows something about the Americans' feelings toward Canada, that they feel they can shuffle this man off on the people in Canada because the Americans wouldn't put up with him?
Well, I have a very strong suspicion that this is what is happening. I can't prove it at this point. General T may be able to enlighten us tomorrow at the press conference, although I don't think T would actually know what the State Department is doing or what the Immigration Department is doing, but it does appear to me that obviously the Americans knew who Quang was, and they knew his background, and our people in Saigon must have known, otherwise they were incredibly stupid. How does this guy get into the States through Fort Chaffee and then into Canada within 11 days? And as I say, the interview by our Canadian immigration officer took between 2 and 3 minutes. Now, you know, if Quang had applied at the Canadian embassy in Saigon when the communists were all around Saigon, I could understand the hurry. But I can't understand the hurry to get Quang out of the United States where he was in safety. You know, surely they could have, you know, gone through his file, his dossiers. Surely they could have identified the man and found out just who he was and what he had done. So that is the suspicious point right there. I don't know why the indecent haste of getting him out of the States and into Canada. And that's what I started from at the beginning. I've asked the minister questions in the House of Commons almost every day now for a month. I'm getting no answers at all. So tomorrow I'm going to the press with General T and through the press to the people.
What has been your reception by the Canadian people? What sort of reaction have you got?
I've received quite a few letters. I would say maybe 25% of them are from your usual bigots who are racists and that type. But certainly the majority of people who've written me from right across the country have, first of all, thanked me for bringing this to their attention, and secondly, are very concerned about these undesirables who are coming in, not just from South Vietnam, but, from other parts of the world, too, over the past several years. We can go back to 1956, for example, and the Hungarian freedom fighters. When they liberated the jails, they not only liberated the bona fide freedom fighters, but they liberated murderers and rapists and everything else. And they sort of, they ended up in your country and my country and so on. Sure, there are risks to be taken in a refugee situation, but with Quang, there was no risk. There was plenty of time to process his application.
Attorney Stephen Young worked for USAID in Saigon in the early 70s. He seems to confirm Mr. Blackburn's concerns about General Quang.
Well, what I presented to him was the information which I received primarily during my years in Vietnam when I was working for the government from various Vietnamese officials and American officials, which related to activities of General Quang. And they sort of fell in various areas in terms of, and one of the problems is it's very hard to get specific evidence that would ever stand up in an Anglo-American courtroom. But people who dealt with these various areas felt very strongly that General Quang, through the use of various intelligence organizations, was organizing heroin smuggling into Vietnam. Subsequent to that, he was involved in the smuggling of luxury goods through using Chinese financiers and offloading ships off the coast and bringing them into villages and then trucking them up to Saigon with trucks which had been provided by American aid but were assigned to the headquarters of the Joint General Staff. And various other things along that line, various other points of his corrupt activities. So also the fact that he was considered to be primarily responsible for most of the political repression under the Thieu administration during the last 5 or 6 years, in his position as National Security Advisor to President Thieu. And his responsibilities were to oversee both the police and the intelligence branch, the special branch, and the military security service, and what do they call it? Central Intelligence Organization, I think.
Okay, you mentioned that he was involved, I believe that Mr. Blackburn said, you mentioned he was involved in the smuggling of heroin. That's been dealt with extensively in a book by Alfred McCoy.
Right, only McCoy sort of blew it, because McCoy is, well, one of McCoy's problems is he comes to his conclusions before he does his research. And had he been a little more attuned in Vietnam, he might have been able to get much more evidence on Quang. But when McCoy went out there, he focused in on what people were telling him about the relatives of Prime Minister Kim, which, in my judgment, was sort of a small-scale operation. And the major operation was being organized by Quang.
Could you give us some specifics of the things that you say he might have uncovered if he had been a little more intensive in his investigation?
Well, for example, there was a major route of heroin traffic coming down from Laos into Phnom Penh in Cambodia, and then overland into Vietnam at the border up there in a place called Go Yau Hua, Godauha, Go Yau Hua, and from there down to Saigon. There was an alternative route by sea from Bangkok in Thailand down to the islands off the coast of Vietnam and the port city of Rat Ya, which is spelled Rachgia, and then from there by road up through the Mekong Delta into Saigon. And this was done on a fairly regular basis. Also, the various channels for distribution of the heroin seemed to go through military security service posts in various provinces. The one case I do know of was in Lam Dong province, Lamdong. People were quite certain that various MSS employees were distributing heroin. When I went out to that border town, Go Yau Hua, to investigate, I was also investigating black market of dollars and smuggling of other kinds of goods both into Cambodia and into Vietnam there. And all these trails seemed to overlap. That people who were doing one were also doing the other thing. And I was tailed by a couple of Vietnamese in a little white car with a license plate that I was later told by some of our drug investigators belonged to the police force. When I also tried to go out at the border, I had a policeman shoot at me, which had a discouraging effect on my activities that particular morning. So that I felt from that particular experience that there was clearly very strong circumstantial evidence that persons involved in the police and intelligence service were also involved in illicit activities, and that such activities could have been investigated by the United States government because they were aware of the allegations, but no serious effort was ever made. And it was my opinion at the time that that was a great mistake, for which there's really no excuse.
Now, you're saying that the center of power in this was Quang.
My understanding was he had, because he was in a position to bridge the finance, which was generally provided by members of the Chinese community, in particular a guy by the name of Lee Lum Tung, Lylong, Tung, Than, who's now in Singapore. To bridge the finance there, the necessity to have appropriate military officers in the right places, like commanders of police stations and district chiefs and things like that, which Quang, as a general working out of the presidential palace, sort of had his share of appointments. And most appointments of officers in the 3rd military region around Saigon were split between protégés of General Quang and protégés of Prime Minister Kim. And there was sort of a back-and-forth flow of officers from those two factions. But Quang would usually get his people in important places. And then, as I say, through his position of oversight of the intelligence agencies and his ability to place some of his people in there, he was able to provide ready access to any point in the country. You know, I mean, no one ever stopped these people to ask for their papers, and they had their own means of transportation, cars, airplanes.
So he had a very sophisticated setup in this.
And then, of course, it was tied in on the political side with the rich elite, the economic elite of Saigon, who were primarily Southerners and Catholics, who had been, to some extent, landlords under the French, but not really. And so Quang had ties because he had been a very important officer in the Kung Lao Party, which was President Diem's political party, which collapsed as a political party in 1963, but vestiges of which sort of stayed on in the concentration of economic power represented by the leaders of the party. And so Quang had again ready access on the civilian side to those people. So the reason for his centrality and his importance to me was, at least in my judgment, was he provided a point of contact between the various elements of a corrupt power system.
There were charges made in 1971, I believe, by the New York Times that Tu and Key were both financing their political campaigns through the narcotics trade.
I think that was Phil Brady for NBC.
NBC, right.
And Phil then got thrown out of the country.
And did you ever run across any of this kind of story that they involving Tu and Key in this dope trade?
Well, except that, I mean, that was at the time when I was there, and I was aware at the time that Quang was involved in heroin, and Quang was a close political associate of President Tu. And I mean, I don't know whether, I mean, I'm not in a position to draw a conclusion, but I must say that's a relationship which, you know, I mean, certainly should give one pause. I don't think there's any way to actually substantiate what Quang did with the money. But numerous Vietnamese believe that one of Quang's major jobs was to, you know, provide funds for taking care of various people in Tu's group. And some of the sources of those funds probably came from the profits of heroin smuggling.
All right, in Mr. McCoy's book, there were many mentions of the CIA's involvement in heroin trafficking, and Mr. Blackburn alluded to possibly that you were hindered in your investigations by the CIA. Did that actually happen? Did you have any contact?
One instance where I was told that if I went to meet a certain colonel, I could hear a tape recording which had been made by members of the Vietnamese Customs Bureau, which outlined the major system for smuggling heroin and implicated General Quang. And I informed the station chief, the CIA representative in Saigon at the time, through the appropriate channels, that because this was not my area of operation, I just informed him that this was an opportunity, and that I requested that he give me a little pocket tape recorder so that I could record as much as I possibly could, because at the time the members of our drug enforcement people were trying very hard to get a hold of that tape recording. And I was told that I could listen to it, so I figured, why the hell not? I was informed by the station chief that he was not going to provide any equipment, and that he really didn't think it was any of my business to be running around looking for tape recording. So I felt that there was at least one case, to my certain knowledge, that the CIA was put on notice that General Quang was at least implicated in heroin smuggling, and they took no action. The conclusion I draw from that was that they did not want to find out the truth, and I consider that reprehensible.
All right, this heroin that was being handled in this system, most of it was due to be used by American GIs stationed in Vietnam, was it not?
At that time, right.
And this...
It was 1970, 1971.
This apparent complicity of the CIA, what conclusions do you draw from this, that they were actually aiding and abetting the addiction of American GIs?
No, the conclusion that I draw is that the insensitivity of senior decision makers, both in the CIA and in the embassy and in the White House and State Department, and at the highest levels of our government, meant that operations could be conducted by our allies, which were inimical to the personal well-being of Americans, to the national interest of the United States, and certainly to the national interest of the South Vietnamese people. And that our inability to be sophisticated and our desire to attach ourselves to anybody in power, no matter who that person might be, completely hamstrung our ability to do the right thing. And I just think it's just a stupid way to run a government.
In Wikipedia, General Quang is described as innocent of involvement in the heroin trade. It states, Quang was accused of being involved in the heroin trade. However, these allegations were disputed. Following a visit to Canada in 1975, he was barred from returning to the U.S. until 1989, when he was cleared of all drug charges. I looked at the source of his alleged clearance, an article in a publication named Washington Decoded. The article claims Quang was innocent. However, the author was a CIA agent who was stationed in Saigon during the war. So what is this episode of the Plutopia podcast trying to tell you? I think we should all be wary of politicians and public figures who see evil in every wave of immigrants. The United States is a nation of immigrants. Those original immigrants invaded a continent that was already occupied by indigenous people who probably felt their land was being overrun by immigrants. You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.